The suspect in this case, Brian Kohberger, is in that courtroom right now for his arraignment. He is in handcuffs. He's wearing an orange jumpsuit. And according to those in the courtroom and some of the video that we're receiving, you can hear the shackles as he walked into the courtroom. The victims' families are also in the courtroom. They have been seen at times crying. This is going to be a tough day for them at the beginning of what is going to be just a horrific process. Brian Kohberger, indicted by a grand jury last week on 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of burglary in connection to the murders of 4 University of Idaho students. Prosecutors took that case against him before the grand jury instead of going through a preliminary hearing that was set for next month. Right now, again, he is in court. We are expecting him to enter a plea, either guilty or not guilty. I want to bring in trial attorney and legal analyst Brian Claypool. To you both, thank you. To be those families right now and to see Brian Kohberger walk into the courtroom has to be just an overwhelming flow of emotions. Brian, let me start with you. How do you as an attorney prepare families for this moment that they face the person accused in the brutal murders of someone they loved so much?
Yeah, hey, Marnie, great to be with you. What I would tell family members would be that attending the arraignment and then attending the trial, likely there's going to be a trial, is part of the therapeutic process of working through the PTSD. I mean, these family members have endured trauma beyond comprehension, right? Their daughter's murdered. And that's the way I would explain it to them, that by facing this head on, by walking into a courtroom and looking Kohberger in the eye will eventually help them process their feelings, process their grief, process their anger, and hopefully get them to a better place in life where they can actually manage their daily life and then maybe find a bigger purpose in life to carry on the legacy of their kids.
Brian, weigh in on this, the knife sheath that was found at the location of the crimes. I mean, how will that play into it, and how will the defense strategize around something like that?
Yeah, exactly, Marnie. The knife sheath, as it stands now, is the most powerful piece of evidence because it arguably has Kohberger's DNA on it. And the only way that Kohberger has any chance of explaining that is his defense team is going to have to hire some kind of forensic expert to analyze how that knife sheath was tested, Marnie. Was the testing accurate? Was it acceptable DNA testing? Were there any flaws at all in the testing of that sheath? And also possibly argue that maybe the DNA had been planted on the sheath. And that's a hard argument, but that's about it. That's all they really have to work with. And to Tracy's point, though, as well, I think, Marnie, prosecutors made did a great job of having a grand jury indictment instead of a preliminary hearing. Why? Because of what Tracy's talking about. There's probably some really powerful evidence in the truck, possibly in his apartment, possibly blood stains that we don't yet know about, right? And had there have been a preliminary hearing, then defense lawyers for Kohberger get a preview of all that. They then have to get to find out what all that evidence is to try to go after it and attack it. Now, they don't get that sneak preview of all the potential DNA evidence that the prosecutor has.
And I ask this in every one of these high-profile cases. Brian, your thoughts on whether Kohberger takes the stand himself, and then also if they call any of his family members to testify?
Yeah, Marnie, before I answer that, one other quick point on the witnesses testifying at a preliminary hearing. Another reason why this helped the prosecutors by not having to have a preliminary hearing is because you then don't get testimony under oath by, for example, the young woman who allegedly saw Kohberger leaving the apartment. She doesn't then get locked into a version of events at a preliminary hearing by testimony under oath that defense lawyers can use at trial then to say at trial, oh, wait a minute, you testified one way at the preliminary hearing under oath, and now you're testifying differently. So this was a big victory for the prosecutors to not have these witnesses come in and testify at a preliminary hearing and get a grand jury indictment instead. And look, in terms of Kohberger testifying, I think it all depends on how the evidence unfolds. We know that the defense is going to argue heavily on contamination of the crime scene, lack of training, for example. Defense lawyers have filed a motion regarding the training records of some of the investigating officers. They're going to go after how the crime scene was maintained and contamination of evidence and try to argue that. So if that's going well in the trial, maybe he doesn't have to testify. But look, at the end of the day, high stakes murder trial like this, I don't know how he can expect to get a hung jury if he doesn't take the stand and say, I didn't do this.
I want to point out to people at home, we have people inside the courtroom who are watching this. There is going to be video inside the courtroom, but it is not live at this point. So we're monitoring it. And I've got a little bit of play-by-play here for both of you. I understand that Kohberger is standing right now in silence, so he is not saying anything in terms of entering a guilty or not guilty plea. As a result of that, we're being told that the judge has issued a not guilty plea on his behalf. Brian, I know that without being there, it's a little difficult, but what do you think is going on here, that he's standing there not saying anything and that the judge then intervenes?
Yeah, well, I think the judge is probably explaining to Kohberger about what a guilty plea is, right? That's the judge's job. He's got to explain to Kohberger the significance of whether he's pleading guilty or not guilty. What's the import of pleading guilty, not guilty? Potentially explaining, here's what's next if you plead not guilty. And that's why he was speaking to Kohberger that way. And who knows, maybe there's also a discussion among the judge and lawyers as well as to what's next. Are we going to set a trial date? Or I know in some cases I've been involved in, they don't set, Marnie, immediately a trial date. They set out maybe what's called a case management conference a few months down the road. Why? Because you can discuss if there's any discovery issues. Maybe the defense needs some evidence they haven't gotten from the prosecution, and they've got to flush that out. Here, we've got an issue of whether there's going to be a death penalty. Does the prosecutor need more time to analyze that before coming to the court and saying, we're gonna pursue the death penalty? So I wouldn't be surprised if the court did not set a trial date and sets a future case management conference.
Yep, and it's looking like there is a hearing now scheduled for October 2nd. Brian Claypool, Tracy Walder, I'm sorry I'm out of time. We're going to leave it there, but thank you to you both. I want to bring in trial attorney Brian Claypool now with reaction to what we just saw. Brian, anything unusual about him standing silent, not entering a plea?
Yeah, hey, Marnie, a couple of reactions. First of all, the judge read every single charge in the indictment to Kohberger. That could go either way. I've had cases where the judge just says, hey, have you read the indictment? Have you talked to your lawyer about the indictment? Do you understand the charges? Yes. And then the judge says, what's your plea? Here, the judge went through it copiously. I think he wanted to make a statement. This case is serious. We're not going to have any issues on appeal. The second issue I thought that was interesting was Kohberger's not entering a plea. You have three choices: plead guilty, not guilty, or no plea. And I think this was just a symbolic statement. Like, we feel good about our case. We're not even going to tell you what we feel. Go ahead and enter the not guilty plea. My third reaction, the October 2nd trial date. I'm surprised by that. I don't think it's going to go on October 2nd. I think you're going to see some discovery disputes. I have evidence possibly not turned over. And but I'd be real surprised if this goes on October 2.
And what are the other options then if it doesn't?
Yeah, well, either side. Well, the defense usually would come in and say, "Look, Judge, I need more time." They file a motion to continue the trial, and Marnie, that happens all the time, especially on high-profile murder cases. I mean, you could see one, two. I've had sometimes three occasions of the trial date being moved. It's not uncommon.
Anything you notice, Brian, about his demeanor and his directness, almost stoic-like nature in answering the judge's questions?
Yeah, great question, Marnie. I thought his voice when the judge said, do you understand those charges? He's like, yes, I do. I mean, his voice was a little bit elevated. Yeah. And I think that was his subconscious way of saying, look, I'm here and I'm going to fight this. I really did notice his voice being elevated instead of passive.
Brian, I got to jump in here. He did not enter a plea. The judge did it on his behalf. Brian Claypool, thank you as always. That's going to do it for News Nation Live this morning.